All right, welcome everybody, and we're sorry for the delay and appreciate your patience. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, an ecumenical Christian think tank focused on the political and social witness of Christianity. I've been asked to moderate this panel titled, "Is Islam Compatible with the U.S. Constitution?" We have four thoughtful people addressing this issue. Each speaker will talk initially for 10 minutes, presenting his perspective. Afterwards, there'll be time for them to exchange with each other and hopefully time for questions and comments from you all. My speakers on the right, and indulge my pronunciation, please, Sheikh Mohammed Amin Kawadia. All right. And Dr. Abdullah Hamid Ali. Thank you for being here. To my left, Corey Walker and Michael Jones. They have all traveled a distance to be here, so we're grateful to them. And they will introduce themselves with 2 sentences to explain their background and current affiliation. Sheikh Mohammed Amin Kawadia, we will begin with you, if that is okay.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for coming. So this doesn't work.
Doesn't work. You have to speak loudly,
Oh no.
like you're preaching to a congregation.
Okay. So I'll do my best to speak loudly. I'm soft-spoken usually. I don't like shouting. Nor do my kids, so I'm okay with them. So I am Muhammad Amin Kawadia. I am the founder, president of Muslim College, which is licensed to offer master's degrees in Islamic law, Islamic theology, situated in the western suburbs of Chicago, Glen Ellen. And we have quite a few students on our campuses, and we're doing quite well. I'm also the president of Al-Amin Ethics Institute, which advises Muslim professionals on ethics. I'm also now the founder of Darul Qasim Academy, the Muslim Girls High School. So now I have these 3 occupations running side by side. And I'm here today to talk about Islam and the US Constitution. And hopefully, if you bear with me, there you go, my savior. Okay, I'll start by, first of all, introducing 1 or 2 theories so that it sets up the stage for your questions and answers later on in the session, hopefully, inshallah. So the first thing is I want to introduce the idea of self-determination for the sovereign state, which you all know is a very common theory, and all sovereign nations abide by it, that every nation has the right to self-determination, legislate its own laws without the interference of other countries. So, England has its laws, or UK has its laws, and Canada has its laws, and India has its laws, and Saudi Arabia has its laws, and Pakistan has its laws. That's called self-determination, and they have freedom to do that, and they have the prerogative to now decide how they want to rule and govern the country. And no other country has any right to interfere with their law. And I dare say that this is observed by George Washington in the very early days of his presidency. George Washington and the early founders were very familiar with Islamic law. In fact, the first country to acknowledge and approve the US as an independent country is Morocco. And George Washington wrote to the ambassador in Morocco that if an American citizen is found guilty of a crime in Morocco, that citizen will be tried according to Moroccan law. and not according to American law. So you see there immediately you have sovereign nation, self-determination coming into place because everybody values that. So that's the first thing. So the US had good ties with Morocco, and even Jefferson, what was his name, Lincoln. Lincoln had a very good relationship with the Muslim communities outside, and he praised one of the Muslim reformers and activists, Abdul Qadir, and they named a town in Iowa after him. It's called Abdul Qadir. The name of the town is Abdul Qadir. So early pioneers of this country were very familiar with Muslim theory, ideology, and politics. They were okay with them. There was no antagonism between the US and other countries in the world. They supported each other. Jefferson, as you know, had his own version of the Quran, so he was very familiar with Islamic law and the Islamic religion. So that's the first point I'd like to introduce as a preamble to the second point. The second point has to do with Sharia law itself. And I want you to listen to this very carefully, because most people don't know this. And they go off on their rockers, disparaging and minimizing the importance of Sharia for Muslims. Sharia is a code of religious practices that Muslims have to follow as part of their religion. That's what Sharia is. Okay? And that is Sharia law also. It's the same thing. So, according to us, we divide the Muslims into two camps. Number one, Muslims who live in Muslim countries. Number two, Muslims who live in non-Muslim countries. The laws are nuanced. They're not the same. So that's why you have to understand from a Muslim jurist perspective how we nuance the two laws. So there's a law for Muslims in a Muslim country, which is the total Sharia, and they have to abide by the total Sharia. And there's a law for Muslims in a non-Muslim country like the USA, and their laws are slightly different. And the law of Sharia is that Muslims are not allowed to call for Sharia law in a non-Muslim country. By law. They're not allowed to do this. There is no way the Sharia will allow a Muslim living in the USA to promote Sharia law in this country. It's not allowed, but by Sharia law it's not allowed. Not through some Western journalists or some, Western scholars like Andrew Page or, who else is there? Other scholars who've written on Islam and Sharia. They're okay, whatever they've written. We appreciate what they've written. But we must understand that the rule for engagement in a non-Muslim country for Muslims living in a non-Muslim country is that they must abide by the law of the land. That is by Sharia law, right? Not by popular law or what Muslim apologists might say. No, by Sharia law. I am a Muslim jurist. I understand Islamic law. I know the nuance that Muslims abide by. So no Muslim jurist in his right mind will ever tell his followers or congregation that you must abide by Sharia law in the USA. It is not allowed. In fact, it's a sin. So we believe that there is no question about whether Islam is compatible with the US Constitution. We say that Muslims must follow the Constitution, and we do. And the US credit to the US Constitution, allows freedom of religion. You have these amendments in the Constitution that allows for freedom of religion, and that's all we ask for. We don't ask for the US to change the laws according to the Muslim mindset or the Muslim psyche. We say we'll abide by the laws of this country. The only thing is that we will not tell Muslims to commit a sin here. So if there's a law that allows a sin, we'll say to Muslims, you can't do that. Like alcohol. Drinking alcohol is a very good example. That you are allowed to drink some alcohol in this country, but Muslims aren't allowed. Not because it's illegal, but because it's a sin. So there's a difference between a sin and something that's legal, illegal. We make that nuance all the time, every day. A Muslim in this country is going to abstain from sin, whether that's legal or not. We will not call for the US to change the law of the land and abolish alcohol and say, make drinking alcohol illegal. We won't do that. But that's what Sharia law is. But that Sharia law is for a Muslim country. It is not for a non-Muslim country. So there is no fear, there's no threat, because we've never said that in our jurisprudence. It's very clearly written in the primary sources of Islamic law, not secondary or tertiary sources. The primary source of Islamic law, which is the Quran and the statements of the Prophet Muhammad, clearly says that Islamic law, Sharia law, is for Muslims in a Muslim country. It is not for Muslims in a non-Muslim country. That you must respect. Because once you've understood this, there is no question. This conference is redundant because we've never seen legally and in terms of jurisprudence, even theologically, we've never seen a contradiction between Sharia and the US Constitution, because we tell our congregation, it's on our website, Darul Qasim website. If you go to darulqasim.org, on the website, you'll see this clearly stated and written, that you must follow the law of the land. So there is no contradiction. We're okay, and that's why we live peacefully in this country. So these are the two things I'd like to bring forward so that the debate goes on, and we look forward to your contributions and to your questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheikh. Abdullah.
It was working before. No, I should have to this night, so that we can put this on your side. I don't like her. Yeah, you read. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum, and peace be to all of you. My name is Dr. Abdullah bin Hamid Ali. I'm the Associate Professor of Islamic Law at Zaytuna College, located in Berkeley, California. I am also the founding director of the Lamppost Education Initiative, which is the partner organization which has organized this particular program today, along with the Collins Center of the Action Institute. Apologies, of course, for the technical difficulties. Hopefully they'll be repaired completely before this program is completed. We also lament the loss of Robert Riley, who wasn't able to make it here today, who I believe is extremely important for this particular conversation, because his book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, has been very instrumental and very influential with respect to certain ideas and opinions about Islam and the Constitution, in particular because he takes a metaphysical standpoint, and he targets orthodox Islamic beliefs, and in particular the group beliefs of one particular mainstream theological school known as the Ash'ari school, and also Imam Muhammad al-Ghazali. And fundamentally, the thesis is that that Muslims' minds were closed from the time of the emergence, or rather the refutation of the philosophers by Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and because of Ash'arite voluntarism, fideism, and occasionalism. And in light of that, it led to a loss of scientific inquiry, which led to the downfall of Muslims. And so we need to return, or if Muslims want to once again celebrate their heyday, then they probably need to return to the pre-Ash'ari or pre-Ghazalian Mu'tazili hyper-rationalism. And so my comments here are going to target at least the theses of what I understand from Mr. Riley. Unfortunately, he's not here, so hopefully I won't strawman anything that he says. And so I imagine that we have the opportunity during the follow-up, the transition, and also during the Q&A to deal with other questions of importance. We could just as easily be speaking of how Islam views the U.S. Constitution, but today's question concerns Islam's compatibility with American legal culture. As Muslims, we understand the challenge of trying to convince an audience of the affirmative. We nevertheless feel it our duty to endeavor to assuage the fears of our countrymen. All of us here today are united in our humanity, nationality, desire to protect our homeland, and to hopefully limit the extent of demonic influence on our government and society. As religious minorities, Muslims live in relative security under an order created with the express intent to protect the freedom to practice many religions, and feel grateful that such a place like America exists despite the threats posed to such freedoms by numerous factions. The question of Islam's compatibility with the U.S. Constitution is a somewhat new proposition, considering the familiarity our founding fathers had with Islam's primary text. As recent as 1935, great legal minds in the U.S. Supreme Court honored the Muslim prophet as one of history's great lawgivers. In similar fashion, and contrary to the contemporary claims, the Library of Congress acknowledged Islam as having gifted the knowledge of physics to Western civilization. This fact provides a point of departure for challenging the claim that Muslim minds were closed to scientific inquiry due to occasionalist theology. Americans don't often appreciate the uniqueness of our civilization. So any claim of scientific stagnation imputed to Islam may also be imputed to other non-Western religions and cultures. If anti-rationalism born of theological voluntarism and occasionalism prevented Muslims from scientific progress, can this also explain the lack of scientific progress among other non-Western European cultures? Why was there no Enlightenment or Industrial Revolution in the Far East? Why did China and Eastern Europe not elect to pursue democratic reforms? Why did non-Western populations not move first to abolish the slave trade? Why the focus on Muslims and the little to no attention to the same phenomenon among non-Western civilizations? In a world without Islam, Graham Fuller, former vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council at the CIA, posits that removing Islam from the picture of geopolitics will do little to nothing to alter the political calculus of nations. Why not? Because the apparent clash between Islam and the West has little to nothing to do with religious doctrine, but everything to do with geopolitics. That is to say that the continuous bloodshed and interventionism into Muslim domestic affairs would remain the status quo even without the presence of Islam. Why does such a thesis not hold water in the minds of Muslim opponents? Why would a genuine rationalist skip over such a thesis and blame so-called Muslim backwardness on political ideology, supposedly constructed from Sunni orthodoxy, rather than material factors which have given birth to the current clash of uncivilized voices? Explaining Islam's incompatibility with the Constitution specifically, and with Western values broadly, is due to a failure to appreciate the difference and interplay between Islamic theology, law, and ethics. That failure represents a betrayal of the very rationalism some claim the Islamic creed led Muslims to abandon. That's because rationalism demands serious consideration of all hypotheses and theories. And science demands experimentation, experience, and induction before a direct causal link can be established between two phenomena. Muslims have never considered science to be at odds with religion. But Sunnis have had a difficult relationship with reason to the extent that reason has been granted legislative authority to determine what is lawful, unlawful, recommended, or disliked. That belief, however, has not led to a denial of the mind's power to discern the benefits and harms of human behavior, proximate and remote. But many a harmful act is permitted despite its harm, and many a beneficial act is prohibited despite its benefit. God assigns a value to every human action, no matter how small. An intelligible reason accompanies such valuations, while others are left without an explanation. So the fact that Muslims believe that God creates human acts has no substantial bearing on human accountability, will, nor one's ability to choose between right and wrong. And all believers are expected to comply with God's commandments, even if he or she may not understand the wisdom of an injunction. The thesis that Sharīʿah occasionalism led to an abandonment of scientific discovery and innovation misapprehends what it means to have a belief. It also misapprehends that not every belief places a practical expectation upon a person. The belief that heaven exists might motivate a person to work diligently to reach heaven after death. But a belief that Israel is the name of the angel of death does nothing to prevent death when it comes. Believing that God is the agent who materializes human actions from the realm of non-existence does not lead to any binding fatalistic consequences on human will, aspiration, or ambition. The human being has no knowledge of what God plans for him. He only knows that it is God who creates when human will moves to execute a certain action within God's kingdom. The examples proving this point are many. According to the Quran, God will judge every soul for whatever it does, suggesting a causal link between these and their concomitant rewards or punishments. Nevertheless, the Prophet said, no one will enter heaven because of his work. When asked, not even you, O God's messenger, he replied, not even me. Only if God envelops me with mercy and bounty from himself. And when asked, O God's messenger, should we not rely on our decree and abandon all work? He said, work, for everyone will be given facility to do whatever for which he was created. Both statements are were recorded prior to the Great Translation Project, which injected Hellenistic rationalism into Muslim civilization. But neither statement discouraged Muslims from appropriating the wisdom imparted by other nations, nor resulted in inactivity and an abandonment of scientific inquiry. Why not? Because believing that one should not put faith in one's good deeds, nor use God's foreknowledge as a justification for action or inaction, did not result in the sort of fatalism and despair presumed by Islam's critics. The Prophet said, flee from a leper the way that one flees from a lion. He also said, there is no contagion. But the apparent contradiction did not lead Muslims to abandon scientific inquiry, nor was it taken as the negation of free will. The first statement, rather, was used as evidence for germ theory, as most Muslim physicians today embrace, while the second statement supports terrain theory, which posits that most illness originates from imbalance within the human body. Once again, voluntarism, fideism, and occasionalism have no direct bearing on liberty, volition, or accountability, nor do they undermine rational thought nor scientific inquiry. That is because they are matters of purely theological import. Believing that God is the author of religious obligation or prohibition does not mean Muslims stop positing what is or was obligatory or prohibited. That Muslims acknowledge that God has a right to our unquestioning obedience without always providing an explanation for why we must obey him does not prove that we believe that what he commands is void of wisdom and unintelligible. Likewise, the belief that God creates human actions After we choose a path of right or wrong, neither removes culpability, nor the motivation to act with prudence, nor does it discourage the search for the ratio legis and wisdom for religious law. Yes, Muslims fell behind the West in scientific innovation, but so did other civilizations on earth. Perhaps that had some connection to our uneasy relationship with rationalism, but it could also have simply been due to Western civilizational progression rather than Muslim regression, or a combination of both. There is evidence of ossification, but to blame all the civilizational problems of Muslims on al-Ghazali and the Ash'ari school of theology overlooks the continued search for meaning through analogs provided in Islamic scripture and the hikmah traditions of Muslim falsafa and Sufism. Pre-modern science relied too heavily on philosophy. Empiricism promised a break from pre-modern philosophy's untested assumptions. In this sense, Mr. Riley's argument is more philosophy than science and attempts to defeat ideology using ideology. Ideology is insufficient basis for predicting the ways humans will act in the future, especially when it relies on simplistic one-cause explanations. Had ideology or creed been sufficient cause for action or inaction, the mere existence of the sword verse would have resulted in a world free of non-Muslims. Muslims would have been guilty of several holocausts, inquisitions, and Muslim crusades. And the only significant inquisition-like event in Islamic history was executed by the very rationalists some believe should have won, not the Ash'aris. Then to which rationalists are Muslims being compared? To those like Aristotle, who believed some people were created to be slaves? To those who introduced the doctrine of discovery? To Catholic inquisitors? To those who barred blacks and women from political participation? Those who permitted slave labor in prison after abolishing the slave trade? Those who prohibited the sale and consumption of wine only to legalize and celebrate it today? Those who used to stamp birth certificates with the word bastard for babies born out of wedlock? To those who once classified homosexual behavior as a mental illness and opposed gay marriage, or those who legalized it and endorse pride parades today? The anti-rationalist impulse has been around for centuries among Muslims, and it is the Ash'aris and Maturidis who saved the Muslim from the abyss of pure fideism. They did so by striking a healthy balance between religion and science, reason and revelation, not by discouraging rational and scientific inquiry. For all its merits, Islam did not need formal rationalism to spread during its heyday. Muslims had already achieved much before its encounter with Greek rationalism, which means faith, not rationalism, led to a spread. Yeah. The truth is that Muslims appropriated every good and useful cultural artifact from other civilizations. And while it is legitimate to question whether Islam's civilizational decay became from al-Ghazali, challenged the legitimacy of Hellenistic philosophy, one wonders why this would make Muslims more threatening to the West and the U.S. Constitution if other non-Western civilizations likewise saw little technological scientific progress during the same period. Are the Amish or Mormons threats to Western values in the Constitution? Can the same question be asked of Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Jehovah's Witnesses, atheists, heathens, Satanists, and religiously unaffiliated? And there's more I could say, but I'll stop there for the sake of time. I was actually trying to use up a little bit more time because Ismail told me I can go into his time. I don't know if he's here yet, but hopefully there's a coherent message there, and looking forward to the conversation, the exchange.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for coming, everyone. I appreciate it. My name is Michael Jones. I run the nonprofit Inspiring Philosophy, dedicated to spreading the truth of Christianity and critiquing Islam. I will say, though, I am on the opposing side today. I, as an American, am definitely concerned about the growing influence of Islam in the West. Feel as though the Muslims who presented today are really great people, but they do not represent mainstream Islamic thought. I think most Muslims around the world would agree with us that Islam is not compatible with the Constitution. But they would argue that it should be done away with and replaced with Sharia law. In fact, I became more interested in Islam. Let me tell you a little bit about how I got interested in Islam. A Muslim online by the name of Daniel Hakikachu, he living here in America, he challenged me to debate the issue of child marriage. He wanted to argue in favor of such a practice, and his reasoning was that this is what Islam teaches. I think everyone should be concerned about the growing influence of Islam when Islamic influencers are arguing for child marriage. But the question before us today is whether or not Islam is compatible with the U.S. Constitution. We're not asking if Muslims can live in the U.S. or be U.S. citizens. We are specifically asking if what Islam teaches is compatible with the Constitution. And it's blatantly clear that it is not. There are many ways this can be pointed out. First, Islam does not have religious freedom as understood by U.S. law. For example, Surah 9:29 says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, nor comply with what Allah and His Messenger have forbidden, nor embrace the religion of truth from among those who were given the scripture, until they pay the jizya, willingly submitting, fully humbled." We can see that the Quran commands Muslims to force Christians and Jews to pay a humiliating tax called the jizya, solely because of our religious identification. The justification for forcing this tax on the Jews and Christians is provided in the following verse. To quote, "The Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, while the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. Such are their baseless assertions, only parroting the words of earlier disbelievers. May Allah condemn them. How can they be deluded?" The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution allows for religious freedom. It would be a clear violation of the Free Exercise Clause to force Jews and Christians to pay a humiliating additional tax because of our religious choice. But Islam demands that Muslims create societies where certain people are discriminated against based on their religion, and specifically for rejecting Islam. This alone is enough to point out that Islam is incompatible with our Constitution and values, but I have more time, so I'll continue. In Surah 489 we read, "They wish you would disbelieve as they have disbelieved, so you may be alike. So do not take them as allies unless they immigrate in the cause of Allah. But if they turn away, then seize them and kill them wherever you find them, and do not take any of them as allies or helpers." Now, Islamic commentators of the Sunni tradition have noted this refers to people who convert to Islam, but then return to their pagan ways. The Quran commands that they are to be killed for changing their religion. In Sahih al-Bukhari, which is considered to be the most authentic hadith collection for Sunni Muslims, who make up 80 to 90% of Muslims worldwide, we read that apostates are to be killed for leaving Islam. You can find this in Bukhari 6899, 6922, 6923, and 6930, among many other authentic hadith. The Shia have similar rulings, which is why leaving Islam is punishable by death in Iran. This is a clear violation of the First Amendment as well. Ordering the execution of one for leaving Islam is a violation of religious freedom. Now, I'm not saying all Muslims think this way. Many do not. But again, we are not asking if Muslims can live in the U.S. or adopt U.S. beliefs. We are asking if what Islam teaches is compatible with the Constitution. It clearly is not. Islam does not have religious freedom as understood by U.S. law. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but in Islam, slavery is explicitly permitted. In fact, the historian Seymour Dresker documents in his book on abolition that when British abolitionists went to an island off the coast of Morocco to try and end slavery, the British governor promptly informed them that that would not be happening, as abolishing slavery was against their religion. The Quran explicitly gives permission to Muslim men to own female slaves, and they're permissible to sleep with, in Surah 4:3, 4:24, 23:5-6, and 33:50. Yes, the Quran allows Muslim men to possess sex slaves. In Sahih Muslim 1602, Muhammad bought an Arab slave for the price of 2 black slaves. There are multiple hadith that show slavery is sanctioned in Islam. Muhammad himself owned his own slaves, including sex slaves like Mary the Cobb. In fact, Muslim countries were some of the last countries on earth to abolish slavery, and this was done because of clear pressure from the West, not because of their own religious motivations, as historians like Robert Fogel have documented. Next, the 14th Amendment means equal protection, no distinction based on religion, sex, or belief. But Surah 4:34 says men are in charge of women because men are above them. If women do not accept their place, Men are advised to instruct them, then separate beds, and then finally strike them. This is a clear violation of equal rights in the 14th Amendment. Islam rejects the idea of equality between men and women, and we see this horrible effects today as we see several reports coming out of Europe regarding rape gangs that have targeted young British girls and European girls. And we see throughout the reports they have used Islam as justification for their acts. Now, I could talk about many other issues, like how Islamic blasphemy laws are a violation of freedom of speech, how divorce and inheritance laws favor men over women, how there's a clear lack of separation of church and state in Islam, how Islamic law violates the 8th Amendment about cruel and unusual punishment, or how Christians and Jews are made into second-class citizens, cannot own weapons, lack clear aspects of freedom of religion, speech, and expression. It is very clear Islam is objectively incompatible with the statement in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If women are not equal to men and non-Muslims are not equal to Muslim men, we cannot say the values of the Constitution are compatible with the teachings of Islam. Now, let's remember the old saying that politics flows downstream from culture. This is true, but culture does often flow downstream from religion or the lack thereof. The religious teachings of a society create the culture, which in turn creates the political reality. The U.S. Constitution is heavily influenced by Christianity, which is why John Adams said our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. If we abandon our Christian values, I'm doubtful our Constitution would survive. An Islamic society would not produce a culture that would lead to the Constitution, and sociological research supports this conclusion. For example, Roland Salem ran a study called The Role of Protestantism in Democratic Consolidation Among Transitional States. His model compared Protestantism, Catholicism, and Islam. He found that nations with higher Protestant populations have more voice and accountability in government, citizen empowerment, political stability, non-governmental organizational membership, and the ability to create beneficial political transformation. Catholicism was positively associated with citizen empowerment, higher levels of NGO membership, and political transformation. But Islam wasn't associated with any of these positive benefits. Jonathan Fox published a study called, Is Islam More Conflict-Prone Than Other Religions? He found, and I quote, Islamic majority groups engage in more than double the average level of religious discrimination as non-Islamic groups and nearly 5 times the average level of Christian majority groups. Religious legitimacy is about 50% more important for conflicts involving Islamic majorities than for conflicts involving non-Islamic majorities, including those involving Christian majorities, end quote. Brian Grimm and Roger Finke say in their paper, Religious Persecution in Cross-National Contexts, quote, persecution of more than 1,000 persons is present in 40% of Muslim majority countries compared to 3.9% of Christian majority countries, end quote. The paper, Culture vs. Rational Choice, Assessing the Cause of Religious Discrimination in Muslim States, says that Christians experience almost 4 times the level of discrimination that Muslim minority groups do in Muslim countries. In the book, Are Muslims Distinctive? M. Stephen Fish found that Islam was positively associated with authoritarianism in low voice and accountability. This data is important because it shows us that the more people are influenced by Islam, the more likely they will create societies and enact policies that are in opposition to the Constitution. Islam would not create a society that would preserve and protect the Constitution, but one that would erode it. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying all Muslims feel this way. But the most likely reason for this is because they've been westernized. If a Muslim follows the teachings of Islam, they must come away with the idea that Islam is incompatible with the Constitution for many of the reasons I listed here. We see the core teachings of Islam deny freedom of speech, religion, and expression, as understood by U.S. law, of course. Islam allows and promotes slavery and denies equality, and instead creates a system where Muslim men are on top and everyone has fewer rights than them. Muslims claim there is equality in Islam, but that is a facade. The doctrines of Islam clearly teach Muslim men are more privileged and have more rights than other groups. With that being said, there is no reason whatsoever to conclude Islam is compatible with the Constitution or Western values in general. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. So basically, my argument is going to be that obviously Islam is not compatible with the core tenets of the United States Constitution. Before I start, I want to say that this is not an argument that Muslims as individuals are not able to be citizens of the United States, that they can be good citizens, neighbors, friends. They are. I'm sure we all have good Muslim friends. There's over 2 billion Muslims in the world. The debate is not about the individual people. It's more about the texts, the systems, and the foundational philosophies that undergird Islam as we see it. And so we're going to talk about whether the holistic, unalterable system of Orthodox Islamic law, known as Sharia, is fundamentally compatible with the supreme law of the United States, which is the Constitution. My position tonight is pretty clear. It's not compatible with the Constitution because they're built upon two more mutually exclusive competing systems of absolute supremacy. One establishes a secular system where laws are derived from the consent of human beings and we are subject to constant change in the Constitution. The other establishes an immutable system in which where law originates solely from divine revelation and cannot be altered by human whim, right, which is Sharīʿah. When the two legal systems claim supremacy or supreme authority over society, they are structurally irreconcilable. So one pillar, I would argue, is a clash of sovereignty, which obviously I would say under the American constitutional framework, the ultimate authority lies to we the people. We are a secular republic. We elect representatives to Congress to write, amend, or completely repeal laws based on the evolving needs of our society. If we, the people, decide a law is no longer just, we possess the absolute sovereign right to change it. In stark contrast, Orthodox Islamic theology establishes that the ultimate sovereignty, referred to as in Arabic as hukum, belongs exclusively to Allah. Human beings do not possess the moral or legal authority to legislate in defiance of divine revelation. The Quran states this explicitly across multiple chapters, right? One of them explicitly states the command or legislation belongs to none but Allah, right? Another states, and whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, then it is those who are the disbelievers. In standard Islamic jurisprudence, the Quran and the Sunnah, traditions of Prophet Muhammad, form an irreconcilable and immutable legal framework that contrasts with our own in the United States. A human parliament or Congress cannot vote to legalize something that God has declared forbidden or haram, right? Nor can it vote to forbid something that God has declared permissible, which is halal. Therefore, we hit a fundamental structural conflict. The Constitution demands that human-made secular law is the absolute ceiling of our authority, and that's what we submit to. However, traditional Islam demands that divine law, right, as written in the Quran, is absolute ceiling. To accept one as supreme requires you to fundamentally subjugate the other. And so I would argue that, many people would say that the First Amendment, which protects religious freedom, which is great, accommodates Islam, which, it does. Like, you can be Muslim, you can be any religion in this country, thankfully. But this argument relies on a deeply westernized post-Enlightenment definition of religion, of which Muslims in this country benefit from in America, but no one benefits from in Muslim countries. In the United States, we view religion as primarily a matter of private conscience. Your personal worship, individual morality is something that's private within your family. You go to your church, your temple, mosque, synagogue, wherever. On the weekend, you do as you wish with your own personal religious beliefs, but you follow your secular law in the week. Traditional Islam, however, does not believe this. It rejects this boundary whatsoever. Islam is not merely a religion. It's not merely a religion. right, as a lot of American liberals believe, is also a comprehensive legal framework in a way that you're supposed to like live your life. So Sharia contains detailed provisions for civil law, commercial contracts, international treaties, rules of warfare, inheritance, and even criminal punishments. This scope creates a direct collision with the United States Constitution, which consider principle of equality under the law, guided by a 14th Amendment. Under traditional Sharia, however, legal rights and obligations are fundamentally differentiated based on gender and religious status. So, for example, the Quran explicitly outlines unequal inheritance structures between men and women. They believe a woman can only inherit half as much as a man. That is in direct contrast with our westernized beliefs in our own constitution, which has equal protection for that sort of thing. Furthermore, regarding judicial evidence, Quran states that the testimony of two women is equal to that of one man in financial matters. A legal system that explicitly codifies an equal status based on gender cannot be structurally compatible with the Constitution that predicates its entire legal morality on the equal protection under the law, right? I would also argue that freedom of speech and conscience is like another element that Islam routinely violates and is in complete contrast with our own American Constitution. So within the First Amendment, specifically freedom of speech, under our Constitution, you have the right to your own thoughts, to criticize whatever religious figures you want, to blaspheme, to completely change your religion if you want. That's not necessarily true. You could be a Christian today, you could be a Muslim tomorrow, you could be Jewish, whatever you want. That's not true in Islamic societies. Under Orthodox Islamic law, these actions are treated very differently. So blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad is not treated as a form of protected speech, but it's a severe criminal offense. So an infamous example of this has happened about over a decade ago in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo shootings, in which obviously that was a satirical newspaper that drew a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, and a bunch of Islamists then barged in and decided to shoot and murder them all. And to this day in Europe, lots of people are terrified to draw the picture of the Prophet Muhammad or even talk about this because they don't want to be murdered by the Islamists that they have imported into their society through lax migration laws, and continue to do so despite that shooting. Even more critically, I'll also say the concept of apostasy, which leaving Islam is universally condemned in classical Islamic jurisprudence. And while my opponents may argue that there are certain parts of the Quran who say that you're not compelled to be a Muslim, that doesn't change the fact that in reality, once a person is inside the faith, they are entirely subject to its laws. In fact, a lot of times people will say that Sharia law in and of itself is only applicable to Muslims. And even though that may be technically true, it's also just true that spreading Islam is an essential component of Islam. I mean, quite frankly, that's how Islam spread and became the dominant world religion throughout the Middle East in the first place. It was not a religion they didn't evangelize people or convince people to be Muslim the same way the Christians did. They spread through conquest. And so forcing people to become Muslim is in many ways, at least in practice, essential component of that religion. Mainstream Islamic schools of law historically mandate severe legal penalties for blasphemy, including execution and for the unrepentant apostate. And then I would also say, in conclusion, the United States Constitution is a product of the European Enlightenment, right? Which is a secular document designed to prevent the merging of religious dogma with state power. Islam is a 7th century divine revelation, explicitly designed to merge faith, law, governance into a singular, unified society under God. To claim that they are perfectly compatible is to do a grave disservice to both. It requires my opponents to either dilute Islam and the uncompromising nature of what Islamic theology represents, or to completely ignore the secular, human-centric supremacy of American constitutionalism. The American Constitution is not, at least in my view, it's not completely blind to religion or neutral on these things. The reality is that the society we live in is derived directly from, the Enlightenment, which was heavily influenced by Christian values. the concept of Imago Dei, that we are all built, all created in the image of God, that is literally out of the Hebrew translation of the Bible. So when we say that America is built on Judeo-Christian values, that is what we mean. Like, it comes from the Hebrew translation of the Bible. Islam is not built on those things, which is why Islamic societies fundamentally look very different than Christian societies, like the United States or Europe, right, which were built on those Christian values. So these are two distinct, not saying inferior or superior, but they're just distinct ideologies. They're running on parallel tracks in very different directions, and they lead to very different societies. And I think that if you look at any society where Islam becomes a major force within the country, within those countries, within those political systems, it changes, right? And we have to ask ourselves, and we have every right to ask ourselves, do we want our society to look more like those places? Do we want our society to look like Iran post the revolution, right? And I would say most Americans believe not. And quite frankly, even most Muslims in this country probably wouldn't want that. So we have to ask ourselves, is this a society that we want to live in? And if we don't want that society, we have to reject the growing influence of Islam in our culture and completely and totally repudiate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cory Buffer. Our host, Ismail Loiter, has now arrived. So
Thank you, and apologies for my lateness. There was a huge ask need up here. So, first of all, I just want to express my gratitude to our guests for coming, and to my co-panelists, and absolutely to Mark Tooley for agreeing to moderate, and also our thoughts with Robert Riley, who was supposed to be with us on the panel, whose work is extremely influential in skepticism towards whether Islam is compatible really with, I think, Christianity to what extent in the American workplace system. I'm grateful to all of you for coming, because he wanted to have a discussion where it wasn't just sort of free of us saying, Islam is compatible with the U.S. Constitution without having, someone to raise the questions that our two friends here very ably raised, and hopefully we can tease out some of the things that they mentioned. So I'm going to start by noting that the question of whether Islam is compatible with the U.S. Constitution requires us to ask, first of all, what is Islam, of course, but also what is the U.S. Constitution? And so if we don't have a correct understanding, or a sort of understanding of the U.S. Constitution that corresponds to reality, then we will go astray in answering this question just as much as we will if we have the correct understanding of what Islam consists of. And I would also say that we thought we were worried about bringing a Muslim to sit on that panel over there to argue with them that no, Islam is not compatible with the U.S. Constitution, because in fact there are many who would in fact argue that, or at least have doubts. And so we couldn't really think of someone who would be rare enough to do that, but there are plenty of anonymous people on Twitter even fine. Or for that matter, I'm sure the Charlie Hebdo people, murderers and say that. So I think one interesting aspect of this is that our friends here mentioned, for example, Charlie Hebdo as an example of why Islam is not compatible with the U.S. Constitution. But if they were sitting, if the murderers were here with us today, they'd be sitting over on that gown over there, and they would probably want to kill us too. So that is an illustration of how you have very strong disagreements between Muslims themselves on a question like this. And so one of my audiences, our audiences here, is actually Muslims. It's not to sit here and to try to explain to non-Muslims why Islam is compatible with the Constitution. That is obviously one of the themes, but it's also to explain to Muslims how being a Muslim and being an American is not incompatible, and in fact does not require you to live with this sort of cognitive dissonance where you kind of are Muslim in one sense and then American in another. And God says in the Quran, He says, and then God didn't create you with two hearts in the chest. It is not possible to sit there and hold two contradictory truth claims in your heart. Foucault and Nietzsche and so on notwithstanding. So what I'm going to do is to address something. Oh, and there's one other question I think that needs to be recognized, and that is, it's one thing to say or dispute or discuss whether Islam theoretically, in the abstract sense, is compatible with the U.S. Constitution, theoretically. And another question to ask whether these specific Muslims over here, some specific Muslims, whether that's in America or Iran, someone brought up and so on, or Charlie Hebdo for them, are compatible with the U.S. Constitution. So I think that no one would doubt that there are Muslims who their behavior and their understanding, their belief renders that, yes, it is compatible with our American constitutional order. And so that is an important question. And our friends over there acknowledge that likewise there are Muslims who, in their mind, are not really practicing Muslims or believing Muslims, or somehow are suppressing, I guess, their understanding of what the true Islam is, in going about their lives and being good Americans. We've heard them say fairly that they're not saying that all Muslims are running around doing stuff like this. It's just that those who do not do that are not actually practicing true Islam, of not understanding the true Islam. And this is an argument that's been, I think, made by many people, Graham or others. So, well, ISIS is the true Islam. This, due respect to Graham, by the way, no, and he's a good guy. But his argument is that, well, this is the true Islam here, and his conclusion that that is the true Islam is that people like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on actually cite the Quran. And there's no doubt that they cite the Quran. There's no doubt that they, at the very least, justify their behavior and their actions and their conclusions from Islamic citations, either that be Quran, Hadith, or sayings of scholars and so on. So let's sort of lay that ground really quickly, and then we can move on. And because we're missing two, I'm going to indulge a little bit with Monster. You were in City of Balance. I'm going to indulge a little bit here. So, first and foremost, what do we mean? What is the U.S. Constitution? What is epistle? Well, the U.S. Constitution is an instantiation or an elaboration of the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is itself, Thomas Jefferson remarked, but I already quoted a lot of people here, and I just don't have quotes in front of me, so I will acknowledge, I'll paraphrase it a bit. Thomas Jefferson said that when he wrote, when he authored the draft of the Declaration, that there was nothing new in it. These were ideas that were around, they were in the ether. And it's very, they saw themselves, the term revolution did not mean what it came to mean in the French Revolution, which is a complete overturning of or the rather revolution at the time of the American Revolution meant a return. A return to what? A return to the principles of the ancient principles of the English. And so that would include the Big Carta, and that would include canon law, and that includes natural law, and for example, the Bicep discussed that in quite detail, to whom I will refer again in a moment. So, and of course, the Bible. The Bible, both the New Testament and the Jewish or children of Israel Old Testament, and then obviously the Greeks. So, what do these principles consist of? The very first one, obviously, most fundamental one, was mentioned by Corey, which is that, and possibly by Michael for an instant, that is the inherent dignity of every single human soul, every human being. Not only inherent dignity, but the equal inherent dignity of every human being. So, it says, and we have ennobled the children of Adam. And the Prophet warned people if they fight or if they strike someone, God strike them in the face. Why? Because Adam is created image of Ar-Rahman, was merciful. And when the Prophet and his companions, they were sitting in a gathering and a procession, a funeral procession of a Jewish man, and the Prophet stood up. And his companions said, hey, that's a Jew, right? That's a Jewish guy. And the Prophet said, is it not a human soul? And so on and so on. So then you ask yourself, well, wait a minute. I didn't think that Muslims believed that, I didn't think that Muslims believed that every human being was created in the image of God. I didn't think that many Muslims don't even know that. Or I didn't believe that, I didn't think that Muslims believe that every human being has inherent dignity. Now there's an interesting fact that many of our scholars of Islam, in fact, said that non-Muslims do not share inherently, by default, fundamentally, the same dignity as Muslims. Some scholars said that any rights that they have and they possess only by virtue of an act or a kind of agreement of peace and of protection of rights between Muslims and non-Muslims. But this is not the only position. If you look at the citations that I just mentioned, that this appears to be the wrong position. Not in fact correct. And Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, elaborated on this his work, ironically, on the punishing of one who insults the Prophet. He says that he says that every human soul, including the non-Muslim, has an inherent dignity, and that this dignity and their inviolability is lost only due to contingent circumstances. Now, if you do not believe that every human soul has inherent dignity, then this puts you quite obviously at odds with the American Constitution, which in fact is rampant in us. But if you do believe that, then you are at least in that component in harmony with the U.S. Constitution. Because of just to turn in the Declaration, it states, with all these truths to be self-evident, and the apologies are quoted, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain equal rights. And we'll talk about which rights are. Self-evident, what does that mean, self-evident? It means that there is no need to prove it. That the reasonable person, by virtue of being reasonable, by virtue of being sane, believes this, knows this, and if you do not believe this, then you are by virtue of that, by definition, not a reasonable person. His reason is not just a process of going from these propositions to this conclusion, but it also has content, and part of that content is that you believe there being has equal dignity, even if you don't arrive there by belief in God, even if you get there through some other means, intuition, or whatever. So atheists also, even though atheists who believe this, no offense to our atheist friends here, atheists who believe this because they are inheriting Christian belief. And so The second point, give me a thought number, because I've been lost for a while.
When Nick we should give a chance for
Yeah.
response from.
All right. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to wrap up here by saying, I'm just going to address them, and this can probably come out a little bit later. When I mentioned that specific Muslims, in other words, we talk about Islam generally in an abstract fashion, theoretically. You can actually have this kind of discussion will be basically everything that you said there are responses to, and you can have that sort of conversation. But then you can say, well, yeah, but okay, but what about Muslims themselves? Like, you can say that because I admit it, in fact, that many Muslims don't know about the hadith that that Adam was created, the Jaga, what the implications of what our Ummah said about those things. But what about specific Muslims? Well, I would challenge you, and I would challenge folks, because I know Muslims. I mean, I was just, for example, at a celebration of the fam that a family had for their child, having started reading the Quran in Arabic. This is something that our Indo-Pakistani brothers and sisters do. And it was a wonderful celebration. It was a barbecue, and it was a family having fun together, and just a joyous occasion. And we're all sitting around saying, hey, and to hell with those kuffar, and people. These are all families who are raising their children in America, getting along marvelously with their neighbors, inviting the neighbors over, wanting to, enjoying and being grateful for what they have, and living here and voting and being a part of it, wanting really nothing more than to live their lives and to raise their children as everyone does. And so what I'm going to say is that do they have this nature? Number one, yes, because of Islam, which they weren't raised upon. Most of these people were not raised in the kind of radical ideology that is often portrayed as Islam itself. All right. And so these are people that you would want as your neighbors, that you might even have as your neighbors. And so I would say that, yes, you can point to certain Charlie Hebdo and stuff, but the Muslims that you're living with aren't Charlie Hebdo murderers. They're just ordinary people. And I was, but not in spite of their Islam teachings, but because of their Islamic teachings, which happen to coincide with reasonableness and sanity. Thank you.
Michael, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I thought that was well stated. I would push back a little bit, though. For example, in the book The Price of Freedom Denied by Roger Finke and Brian Grimm, they say that American Muslims are the most westernized, the most secular in terms of their values. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of really great American Muslims, but they've moved so far away from what Islam teaches. And if we're going to talk about if Islam is compatible with the Constitution, we just can't look at Muslims on the ground living in America, which have been heavily westernized. We have to look at what the Quran teaches, what the Sunnah teaches. That's why I focus in on my opening statement specific things like Surah 929, many of the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari about the killing of apostates. So I think if we focus too much on that, we're not counting in the various influences on a lot of American Muslims. Instead, we should look exactly at what Islam teaches. So in my opening statement, I focused on what Islam teaches, and I focused on the sociological research, the effects coming out of Islamic societies as a whole. We can always point to people on the ground. You look at this guy right here, he's great. Look at that guy over there, he's great. Yeah, that's anecdotal. But what is the actual evidence showing us? What are we finding when we get in the sources? I for one, think there's many American Muslims that are living very peaceful, wonderful lives. It's probably most likely because they've been westernized and they're not going on the core tenets of Islam. That'd be the pushback I'd give.
Well, okay, thank you. And what I would say in response to that is that this for just at least to name an example there. This is a family celebrating their child's learning the Quran and reading the Quran. And I also want to mention this. Maybe if you have Googled me, I spent 13 and a half years in federal prison for terrorism-related offenses. Made very serious mistakes. So I, if anyone, know very well the kind of teachings that you are referring to. And I used to, in sitting in the Supermax prison in ADX, Colorado, I used to have debates with Richard Reed, the guy who tried to blow up a mayor playing with the shoe in 2002. And I would say to him, when you debate about the killing of civilians and whether Islam allows us or doesn't allow, then I'll tie it as a real ideology. And I said to him, because whenever I'm going to say something to him, we'll come back with, well, boom, this sort of, right? And this hadith, and this, they're just the same ones that you guys were referring to, And I said, well, gee, how do you end it? Well, this scholar said this scholar said that. So, where did you get all your hadith from? Where did you study? And he's like, I have a PDF that I got from Qatada, and it was applied ideologue based in London. And I looked at the PDF that he had. They had studied these things in London, and even in Afghanistan. Here he was at Qaeda. And I looked at this stuff, and I'm like, you know what this guy did? This guy went and cherry-picked a bunch of sayings and a bunch of verses and a bunch of, and he created a montage of a belief which then was drilled into these people, So I like to say that really the only people whose ideology is, I'd say that people like folks like Robert Spencer, and no offense to him, because actually a bad kind of said no. Robert Spencer and ISIS, really have the very similar understanding of Islam. You know what I mean? And you yourself, like your understanding of Islam is basically like ISIS. It's just that you think that that's bad, whereas they think that that's good. But you all would agree on. That's why I say, you could have these guys over here on your side. But for us, we say these people are misunderstanding the religion, So,
Well, this is just to say real quickly, I understand where you're coming from. I understand you want a more positive picture of Islam. I respect that. I hope that you're actually successful within that, and that, the ISIS view of Islam doesn't become the mainstream. Unfortunately, you see a lot of evidence of that, I'd say, when pulled down from the Muslims. But my retort would be you did focus a lot on what the Islamic sources are teaching, and I think that's important because when ISIS, for example, you brought up, is justified that they're going to the sources, they're going to what the Prophet taught, they're going to what the Quran taught, and that's very, very important. So if we're wrong, two things we should see. We should see Islamic teachings that actually counteract the stuff, maybe show that Surah 9 is abrogated, for example, which I don't see any evidence in the tafsirs or the Islamic scholars. And the other thing is we should see it in the sociological data. So I spent a lot of time studying the sociological data. We see that Islam leads to more authoritarianism, more conflicts, more persecution and discrimination. And this is coming out of actual sociological models that have been run by experts. So at the end of the day, anecdotal evidence is interesting, but it doesn't refute the overall picture of what we're seeing coming out.
Yeah, and I'm not resorting to anecdotal evidence as much as I am, inductively, using such examples as representative of overall patterns. And the thing is, I'm not actually interested in simply portraying Islam positively. If I were, I would have invited you gentlemen. I'm interested in I'm interested in dig deeper into these things. Would you and others challenge these points and raise these points, and it forces us to think about those things and to discuss those things? There's no question that the Muslim world, generally speaking, is a basket case. You know what I mean? There is authoritarianism. There is, dictatorship. There is intolerance. There is social strife and so on. Those things are happening. Is that because of Islam, or is it because of other factors that are, correlation is not causation. So you don't have, for example, dictators or he's kind of citing the verse of the sword, as you mentioned. They're citing their own survival as dictators, and so on. So I think that the fact that you do not have particularly thriving, Islamic civilization right now is not necessarily attributable to Islam itself. Anyone have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, first of all, you're not as part of, the exegesis perhaps. I don't think we should speak about its interpretation. That's a very academic approach. We teach the Quran, 6 years, 12 years, and all the verses you cited, they are all contextual. They're not literal. You're taking them literally, but they're not literal, they're contextual. You must learn the religion from the people of the religion, not from the people who are antagonistic to the religion. So I would really suggest that, first of all, your premises, they're not very academic. And I really suggest to you that you come and study with somebody who knows the religion as a practitioner of the religion, and ask what those verses actually mean, ask what those hadith mean. I teach Bukhari. I've been teaching for years. But all of those hadiths that you mentioned, they don't mean anything you suggest that they mean. They're contextual. Actually, you must understand the academic value of this discussion, this panel. It has to be academic. It can't be just based on something. Go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And it really interesting. This is also an anecdote, if it is a word, but it illustrates something here. I remember Richard Reed saying to me, when it comes to attacking civilians, Ibn Rushd, he said that when an army comes into an area, it is permissible to kill those who are not fighting, just kind of random. Obviously, you're not allowed to kill women and children and under some rules of war, which by the way are not even applicable in our situation we're talking about. But anyway, and he said, but Ibn Rushd said that you are allowed to kill those who are not fighting, like basically just farmers, men, military-aged men that were not fighting, non-combatants. I said, did he said that? I was like, okay. He's like, yeah, he quotes for me. Why did Ibn Rushd say that? Well, the great thing about EDX is they had an amazing library. And so I ordered ordered form, and I ordered down that book, the English translation. And I looked at what Ibn Rushd actually said there, and I was like, no, Ibn Rushd is like quoting like 5 or 6 different people, you know what I mean? And he says there is this opinion, but other people said no, he was wrong about that. So it is very possible, again, to do a montage where you go and you pull that out, and you pull that out, and you put together a really interesting, unique kind of thing that you call Islam. And you can do that, and Al Qaeda can do that, and they have done that. You know what I mean? But those are decontextualized. And now you might say that, you are decontextualizing by taking only those interpretations. For example, the verse of the sword. There are actually, if you look in the tafsirs, they do say that many of them scholars said that that verse was it. The question is, well, does, like, for example, there is no compulsion on religion. Is that first abrogated by this verse that you're talking about? Well, many of them said no, that wasn't abrogated, and that only implies in the situation of war, or it only applied in the situation of the mushrikeen or the polytheists, and that. So if you wanted to, you could go and you could look at only those interpretations of those verses that are reasonable and that are in conformity with the basic principles of Islam, that every human being is created in dignity, and you could you could have an understanding of Islam that is the polar opposite. Like, you would think this is like the people who are not even the same religion at all. You know what I mean? And that's in fact the case. Because our faith, our understanding of our faith, this is not cutting a positive spin. It's just that, like, this is reasonable. It's normal. It's natural. If you don't believe that every human being is created with equal dignity, you are not a reasonable person. So
to respond to a couple of things that are said there, I understand where you're coming from, that there's all these different various opinions in there. That's going to be more problematic, I think, for your side then, because you're allowing the idea that you could have a very ISIS version of Islam based on that. That is a huge problem, because you're not saying that this is the proper way. You're saying there are multiple ways, and you've admitted in your opening statement that there are many Muslims, I'd say the majority globally, that actually be on our side that Islam is incompatible with the Constitution. And with regards to learning from scholars, I totally agree. This is why I read people like Ibn Kathir, for example, who talked about Surah 256 being abrogated by later verses, and said many scholars take that opinion, for example. So
He mentions the difference.
he mentions differences. Yeah, I was about to say that. So there's that issue right then and there. With real quick on the sociological data, I think we're setting up a false dichotomy. It's not Islam or other things. It's multiple things. That's why we run these multivariable analyses, where Islam is another factor contributing to conflict, authoritarianism. So if you're correct, we should be seeing this in the real world data. Islam should not be a variable in the sociological models leading to more conflict, violence, oppression, authoritarianism. If what you're saying is correct, the real world data stands against that. With regards to Surah 929, I agree that we should contextualize it. Absolutely, but the context is there. It doesn't say anything about defense of wars. It specifically refers to those who were given the scriptures, aka Jews and Christians. Muslims are considered to fight them.
That's a very literal. That's not what Jesus said. We don't understand that ayah to be literal.
Okay, well, what I'm saying though is that I need to see evidence in the Quran that is not literal, not just this random statement, because there are many Muslims, including scholars like Ibn Kathir, who did take it very literally. And the context, again, is that the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. That is the reason they are to be basically forced into second-class citizens and fought until they do. It's not about defensive wars.
Oh yeah, we got two questions from the audience.
Before can I actually read a statement that I could have to use really important for context. The reason I tried to approach the issue in response to Mr. Riley's his thesis itself, because I think it sets sort of a metaphysical foundation for this particular discussion. And of course, he targeted one particular theological school and one particular scholar, it was mentioned before that Islam doesn't make the distinction between church and state, and I think that fundamentally the problem is that there's a misapprehension about what Sharia is itself, first and foremost, and that Sharia in its essence, of course, is revealed law. And when we talk about how that we don't make a distinction between matters of the secular realm and matters of devotion, only in the sense that God ultimately, he assigns value to every human action that one is involved in. So that for that reason, economics is not outside of the realm of Sharia. Politics is not out of the realm of Sharia. Why? Because a politician does things, right? And so in everything that a politician does, the Islamic law has a judgment for a moral value that assigns to that particular action, right? But that itself doesn't mean that Islam's positive law does not address or accommodate everything else that one actually will have a concern for when it comes to, for example, we call sort of the rules of statecraft, right? And so for instance, in Sharia, there is a distinction between the judgments which are compulsory upon or expected from a common Muslim who is governed by a particular government, and those who are in government. So often the people they express an anxiety about, for example, Muslims want to impose, for instance, certain penalties, etc., right, or change the laws of the book. That is not the concern of the common Muslim. That's the concern of the governor. If a Muslim governor fails to actually enforce what we call hudud, that is his particular failure. That's his burden. That's his particular sin, right? The common Muslim who doesn't have that responsibility to impose those particular type of penalties or judgments over the population, that is not the person's common Muslim's concern. And this is exactly why Muslims living in a non-Muslim majority land, that they themselves, that they don't find or generally don't find any uneasiness about doing that, especially there's a long history of this as well. Muslim living under non-Muslim rule. I believe in Senegal, the first 30 years of Senegal, the president was a Christian, right? So Muslims didn't revolt against that particular man. just because he was a Christian. But there's certain, and even though they were the majority, Muslims were the majority, and so they're actually president that was Christian. So, but the fundamental point is that certain judgments apply to the governor, certain judgments apply to the governed, and Islam accommodates or actually conforms, it adjusts, right, to the given situation that Muslims find themselves in. So that in itself, that particular fundamental principle makes it easy to establish that, of course, Islam is clearly compatible with the U.S. Constitution. And we go further, like, for example, a couple more things I'll say, is that because there was statements made about, okay, well, yeah, John Adams did say that the Constitution is made for a moral and religious people, true, but he didn't say that made for Christian people, right? And there's also a constant suggestion that the Constitution, of course, America is a Christian country, but in the Treaty of Tripoli, between Morocco, or between those Barbary states and the United States, right at the very beginning of Article number 11, it says, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption to the harmony existing between the two countries. So I just wanted to introduce that, and before we hope it is up to the audience.
Let's go to questions. Come on, because we're already at the top. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
What was your in the middle, sir?
Sheikh Amin Khawada, Sheikh Habib. Amin.
Sorry about that, thank you. So Sheikh Amin, you said something to my friend Mike Jones. You had said something along the lines of non-Muslims shouldn't be presenting things from the Quran. They shouldn't be teaching things about the Quran. So you said something along those lines, perhaps. Sorry.
Well, I think not to speak for him, but I think what he was saying was that before, expounding on the Quran, that one should try to understand how Muslims themselves understand on that verse. That's kind of how an outsider might understand, because if you don't believe something, you can't really understand it. Otherwise, I think so.
Oh, well, so my real question, I just want to make sure that I wasn't misquoting you or mischaracterizing you at all. So my question is, are you getting that idea from the Constitution and the freedom of speech and freedom of religion? Or are you getting that from Sharia law, Islam, and isn't that actually in contradiction with the U.S.?
There's no contradiction in academic standards, even in U.S. laws. So you can't have a common person go to a court and then, it be representative for, the two parties. You need contradiction, you need academic contradiction. That's just more healing behavior. That, if you want to repair your car, you focus on the other part. Now, there's a freedom of provision. It's basically having freedom of academic abilities. You need to understand that if you don't have the academic ability to understand an academic, based on an academic document, then you shouldn't be doing it, because you're qualified. It's not confrontation, it's not freedom.
So I would add to that, by the way, there's another layer to that, right? It's just like, on the one hand, yes, you have to have like a kind of basic grasp of how the Muslims understood a certain thing before presenting what it means. Because I'll give you an example. Like when I was a teenager, someone gave me a VHS cassette. That's how old I am. And I started watching it. It was a guy who was like sitting there saying, talking about the Jews, he's like, here, look at this Jewish encyclopedia, and I open it up, and here it says that the Goyen are nothing but animals, and here it says about Jesus, and here, so this guy is not Jewish, you know what I mean? And so he is he's going and cherry picking things from the Talmud or whatever, and trying to claim that this is what Judaism teaches, and maybe there are Jews out there who kind of focus in on those things and have that kind of spin. But I know I grew up among around Jews, and I just did like with these both of these gentlemen, we did a massive project with 30 scholars of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and I know that it's not what Jews believe. I know that it's not what they believe. You know what I mean? So the example here is, and there's another layer to that, which is that it's very difficult to understand something if you don't believe it. For example, but we believe.
How much we give your attention to follow, but one short point I just want to make is that regardless of how Muslims understood the verse, the real question is, why didn't Muslims apply the verse, right? Because as mentioned before, had Muslims actually applied the verse in the way that people believe and Muslims understand it, there will be no non-Muslims on the planet.
Right.
So just as a quick follow-up, two-parter. I'm a Christian, so from Christian beliefs I see this in the Bible. God says, like, seek being and finding when you see him and follow your heart. Come, let us reason together. He wants us to pursue him, even if we're not quite there yet. He wants us to get there with him. But if your qualifications that you're presenting are necessary, or you have to have some rigorous level of academic qualifications, then what did Muhammad have in those regards?
He had all the qualifications. He had exceptional qualities. He was given revelation which is beyond any qualities. So that's our position. That theologically, Muhammad as the most intellect of all he could have been. That's our theology. So what was more than occupied? He works the law tonight.
Let's go to another question. Anybody else? Yes, gentleman in the front row.
Yes, I just want to.
Can we give them a mic?
We don't have a mic. Work on it.
Okay, the battery's dead. It's about.
Oh, I guess it's order. We can hear him just fine.
Yeah.
Just want to thank everyone for joining. I'm pretty critical how Islam, like a lot of that has to do with like calls for Islamophobia laws and shutting down criticism. So, as of everything, that always looks suspicious. And so when we see open discussion, that's much less concerning. And so hats off to everyone for agreeing to play appearances on joining here. My question was on, as one example, killing apostates in Islam. So you have the hadiths, and you guys seem to be saying we'll take a more nuanced approach and look at other things and look at various scholarly positions and so on. And you were pointing out that Mike's views seem to align more with like ISIS or the Sharīʿah guys. And I think the reason for why they'd be looking at me the same way is there will be the same text and going, Muhammad said, if anyone leaves this Islamic religion, kill him. And they're taking it seriously. But you go to Surah 4, verse 6 and 5 of the Quran, and it says they can have no real faith until they make you, Muhammad, judge in all disputes and have no resistance against their decisions. So it seems like that provides a pretty strong incentive to take what Muhammad says very seriously. And so we find large percentages of Muslims in Muslim countries taking commands like apostates very seriously. And so my question would be, practically speaking, in terms of real world consequences, what would be the difference between a religion that says kill those who lead the religion and really means it, and another religion that says kill apostates but doesn't really mean it, but sounds so much like it means it that it convinces large portions of populations to take it very seriously? Like, practically speaking, you still end up with.
Yeah, this goes back to my first statement in my talk about self-determination, where Muhammad's dad wanted to rewrite his constitution after the war. They had a problem with one of the laws, which was apostasy law. Muhammad's advice was that while they were writing the constitution, and they were a bit hesitant to write this law of apostasy, which is an Islamic law. And she said, you are a sovereign country. You have the right to self-determination. You can push that law in, and we won't say anything against the law because we don't have the right to intervene in your law. So they provided this whole fundamentalist rights. I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can I just add to this that once again, even with what Chikamee says, she's talking about the level of the state, right? A state injunction, not the belief among common Muslims that they go out and kill apostates. The Prophet never killed anyone who left Islam simply because they didn't believe him anymore. The people who actually were killed were people who killed other people on other things like that. But beyond that, I mean, this is kind of the attempt to try to revise, right, Islamic history with Islamic law, because we do know that it has been normative, right? But every particular society has particular values that they work in accord with. And so, like we were talking earlier about, okay, religion, the word religion, and what qualifies as religion. Like if you ask Karen Armstrong, like you read her article talking about the myth of religious violence, you know, she actually goes as far as saying that pre-modern religion didn't qualify as religion. The only religion that actually qualifies as religion today is Protestant Christianity, right? Because it has this clear separation between church and state. So anything they say about Islam, they say about Catholicism and so many other branches of Islam. You know, so the second verse you quoted, that particular verse is by Muslims, is always been understood by Muslims as referring to Muslims. The idea that they had to comply with the commandments of the Prophet. That wasn't the verse that was taken to mean, okay, that this is, you know, this justification for Muslims now and compelling people to become Muslims. So those are just two things I say.
Yeah, no. I mean, I would respond real quick to also what he said. I mean, Sheikh Abdullah, Dr. Abdullah has an essay addressing this issue. Apostasy as an introduction. Multiple, but one of those places is in the introduction to a monograph that I wrote on Pakistan's blasphemy laws. So if anyone wants to read that in more details, it's Pakistan's blasphemy laws and non-Muslims that I wrote in about 2018 and 2019. And he wrote a very good discussion on that. But I think that if you look at Judaism and Christianity, both of those phases. Now, Christianity, obviously, textually, you can't find the same, and yet encouragement to kill the one who leaves Islam, who leaves Judaism, who leaves their religion, as you do in the Old Testament. The New Testament doesn't obviously out. But that being said, Christians did historically find many reasons to persecute and kill people who or otherwise pressure, or with capital or horrible punishment, those who left the religion or adopted heretical views, including Massachusetts Bay colonies, where you can be a Quaker, and Quakers would have their towns pierced with burning rods and so on. And there, this is the kind of point I'm driving, the Massachusetts Bay colony, their covenant and their compact is one of those compacts that was drawn upon for the American Constitution. Okay, so, but what the U.S., what the Declaration did was that, and this is to get to his point about what was written in the Treaty of Tripoli. In the one sense, it's true that the United States is not like a Christian country in the sense that it's not like a sort of Christian, kingdom or something like that. But what it is that absolutely derived from Christianity in the sense that it is the Declaration is generalized at a high level of generalization that all Christian sects at the time, and certainly Jews, and even it was contemplated Muslims would be able to agree with. So in other words, though they generalized from principles that sort of like, all right, well, we're not going to fight about whether you can. We're not going to allow people to be punished because they use this conflict prayer instead of this over here. The Baptists, whatever, or they're Quakers or dissenters. We're not going to allow that. And so I think that when you and yet the people who signed, but they were not deists, nor were they enlightened. I disagree. Of course, the Declaration and the Constitution are not products of the French Enlightenment whatsoever. They preceded the French Revolution. And the United States Constitution is, and the Declaration, the American Constitutional Order, is in fact grounded in belief in God.
I just want to say.
So it's not grounded in the belief that human beings are sovereign. It's grounded in the belief that God is sovereign, and that human beings exist to worship. And that's what's meant by the pursuit of happiness.
I just want to say really quickly, I think when we're talking about Pakistan and blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, I think that's just clear evidence that Islam is not compatible with the Constitution, because when Muslims are the majority in the developed countries based off the Sharia, based on what Islam teaches, they come up with things like apostasy laws and blasphemy laws. That's what would happen in the U.S. if the majority became Muslim.
Well, read my paper.
I'll check it out.
Yeah,
Sure, yeah.
Read my paper. It's called Access West
We're going to fix that those are, again, anomalies. That what we see when Muslim countries produce governments, they don't produce something inhabitable with the Constitution.
I have a question from the audience, maybe one for Michael and I'll press for. Yeah.
Basically, I'm West African, right? So as you know, the slavery recently called BRB. Give a formal apology, and I'm really probably part of other religious Christian reports that kind of have given apologies before, but not as big as it's supposed to be. It kind of shocked the winner, right? And this apology was led by a Christian leader that gave the green light, the religious authority to go and enslave West Africans, right? I am West African myself. Before it was such a thing as Christian in the land of West Africa, it was dominated by Muslim scholars. It was dominated by likes of the Timbuktu, it was dominated by likes of the Yamuka, the Madinka, all these tribes that brought Islam to West Africa, right? So for what you are depicting of Islam to my people, it's completely foreign in this light. But this is from religious authority. So from the basis of what you open up your you open it from the basis of Christian theology, right? So for me as a West African, in my history as our people, do you think we should look at Christianity the way that you look at Islam from your basis?
Where you actually go and cite religious texts and understood and how it's manifested in society, I would absolutely encourage you to do that, to look at what the New Testament teaches, to look at the sociological research on Christianity, absolutely. Look at Davis Brown's research, how Christianity creates a restrictive war ethic and actually leads to Roland Tussaud's research, which I cited here, which leads to more citizen empowerment, more voice and accountability, less authoritarianism. So absolutely, do put Islam and Christianity side by side, study them in the sociological effects, and then study what the texts teach. Absolutely, we went to what the Quran teaches, we went to what Hadith teaches.
The next part to that particular statement. Did you want to say anything before?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody. One thing I want to say is also like kind of look at what's happening now across Africa, how Christians are being repressed and murdered by Islamists, how quite frankly it would get slavery that existed in the Middle East and Muslim countries far after Christian countries abolished them. Yes, slavery, unfortunately Christians being fishing this state is not by slave trade. But Christianity is also used the basis for abolishing them, but not saying that not also decided to order Islam. Slavery in itself is a violation of Christian values. I don't think you can say the same for this all in the Islamic world. So I would say that, like, even though some of what said is correct, I think that we're kind of papering over the real oppression that people are facing, Christians are facing, like in West Africa to speak. I mean, I think in Nigeria, I mean, some of what they call it genocide officials about that, and then really 5 Christians are built for every 1 Muslim. They're really going to Christian churches, mowing people around, pulling them out of the church, videotaping them as a pilgrim in Nigeria. There's very little paid to that. So the practical citizenization, from the founders and people, the forced citizenization that people are going through in countries, even countries that are 50-50 Christian and Muslim like Nigeria, I think kind of undercuts the point you're trying to make.
Yeah. So wait. I don't want to go into the Nigerian because there's a lot of recent information you shared. So let me just kind of like step over that a little bit. I want to get back to Dokor, right? Because when he was kind of like replying to the share, he was bringing about like the Islamic authority, right? To say, hey, there's a part of Islam in a sense that this was something that the authoritative scholars have brought. So what we are sharing about specifically about Dokor, because as a Christian authority, being able to bring to the light and say, hey, we as a religious authority figures endorsed for 400 years of enslavement of West Africans. And when you're talking about exactly how Christian values you brought to what's. Let me give you some prime example. One, the changing of border lanes, where now you actually have a cousins that have been split. So this is my cousin. I won't be going. I'm saying, hey, what's up? How are you doing? Now, as Christian, when you come to my land, you put a border line. Now I get a passport to go and go visit my cousin. Now I'm going through many demonstrations and demonstrations. So now here as a Muslim that is going on towards Africa, my mindset is coming from the different bases of Jews. Now my question about this is it fair, objective to fair, for me now to judge your Christian religion based on what happened to not be?
No, I didn't say we should do that word for Islam either. We don't take hand and go cases and judge the whole religion. We look at what we look at what the texts teach. We look at what is showing up in the sociological models, and then we judge based on those combined. Just going on anecdotal evidence is not going to give you a full picture, because there's various variables that go into various conflicts, and I would never deny that. Islam is still a variable that goes into these events that are happening throughout the world, and the research is showing you that when you weigh the other variables, you do see Islam is associated with these things and Christianity is not.
My vote, though, could I make an interesting point? I think it's interesting that you could find the very same in American society. You could find people arguing vociferously from Christian texts for slavery, and you could also find people like the abolitionists and so on arguing against it. You know what I mean? So here you have two people reading the same text, and the question is which one of them is correct? Which one of their understanding of the Bible is most reflective of what God wants? That's a very similar type of debate that you have among Muslims. You know what I mean? Where it's like, okay, this guy over here is saying, well, non-Muslims don't have inherent inviolability. And well, we over here will say, no, yes, they do. Why? Because of this and this and this. So the question is, I think this happened within Christianity as well, where ultimately someone's saying, hey, wait a minute, this is totally wrong. And you can see this debate at the Dred Scott decision with the majority opinion versus the dissents, where the dissents are saying, so I think that within religious traditions, you have a sort of sorting out of which values are conflicting with other values and practices and current beliefs, and ultimately some will decide that that a consensus will build that we have been really untrue to our own faith, and this is, for example, what Frederick Douglass argued. So I think that is the same process that happens within Islam, and where you're not having like an outside reform type thing, where you come out and you say, no, you just got to scrap all that, we got to come up with some new thing, as the French did it, with the French Republic. But rather what the Americans did, or at least the founders, they tried to find what was truer. Yeah. So that's what we need to do as well. I'm not denying that Muslims need to do that. We do need to do that.
We're running out of time, so why don't we let each panelist give concluding remarks, starting to Corey.
Okay.
Getting back to the original question, is Islam compatible with the U.S. Constitution? Yes or no?
All right. Well, going back to the original question, I think that we kind of call out this.
Speak louder.
Yeah, you get.
My doesn't work.
Maybe you slow.
No, you slow. That's share. Thanks. So, getting back to the original point, I think it's been very clear that Islam itself is not compatible with the United States Constitution. If we value the things that we hold dear, or misclaim to hold dear in the Constitution, or human rights, women's rights, free speech, it doesn't value those things that we claim to value. So, for example, there's some points that maybe we can make earlier. Like, for example, you look at 52% of British Muslims believe that according to the Anglo-Saxon society, that's illegal to drop your children off Muhammad. 38% believe that Sharia law should be people face British law. Only 1/4 believe that Hamas murdered and raped people on October 7th in Israel, and are also more likely to receive Hamas as positive and negative. In fact, if we look at our own issues in the United States post October 7th, because it's unfortunately an individual Palestine conflict has become globalized, I see a lot of really troubling elements in our society that impact our country. You have people marching around with flags celebrating the loss in Hezbollah. Now, regardless of what we think about Israel or Palestine, I'm not saying, it's a good position on that, I'm not steering you away, but I do think it is really troubling that these extremely liberal ideologies, these extremely liberal political parties that exist in other countries are starting to gain popularity and traction in the United States, not just for Muslims, but also with, secular white kids that go to, IB campuses. And so we gotta have a serious conversation about how this is impacting our country and our society, and do we want more of this in our society? And if you do value the American way of life, I think that you have to reject political Islam. I'm not saying you have to reject Islam papers, but the political manifestation of Islam, which is very difficult to disentangle for Islam as a religion, because I saw as though political ideology and religious one.
Yeah, I'll just briefly summarize. I mean, we spent a lot of time citing what the Islamic text said, and the only thing I wrote on that is that we're now scholars. That doesn't change anything we said, and it's very clear evidence that the Quran, the Sunnah, what Islam teaches, is incompatible with the Constitution. We see it really endorsed with slavery, various aspects of the Second Amendment, which I briefly touched on, violation of the First Amendment. You're not allowed to leave Islam. Jews and Christians are forced to pay the jizya. This is a violation of the First Amendment. There is no way around this. So it is not a question, but I've heard from a lot of the other panelists today, I have great respect for, is that, yeah, Muslims can live in the U.S. No one's denying that. The question is what does Islam teach? Is it compatible with what the Constitution teaches? It does not. These are vehemently opposed to each other. This is why we see in Muslim countries, they're not creating governments that are like the U.S. government. They're not creating constitutions like ours. They're creating ones based on the Sharīʿah, where Christians are not being treated as equal, given the same rights as Muslim men. Women are not being treated as equals by the 14th Amendment. So at the end of the day, I've seen no evidence Islam is compatible with the Constitution. We raised several points to show that Islam is incompatible with the Constitution, and those were not addressed. But I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Dr. Ali? Yes, thank you. I often get the impression that one of the main reasons that many anti-Muslim Jawakars they have so much animus towards Islam is because of the fact that the left and many of the media apparatus have actually spent a lot of time sort of propping up Muslims and attacking Christianity and Christians. And this is something I think Muslims need to acknowledge, that this does happen. There are Muslims who are leftist, Muslims that are socialists, Muslims who in the political realm are very popular Muslims who actually do attack Christianity, white people, etc., things like that. And also because Islam is in competition with Christianity, with Christians for conquerance, right? So this has been the case for many centuries, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that coming back to the question of whether or not Islam is compatible with Islam, I said yes, Islam is compatible with Islam because Islamic law actually accommodates both the level of government and the private citizen. Those who are governors, the Muslim governor is the one who has the obligation to actually enforce a lot of the scary things that people, talk about. We talk about the hudud, the Sharīʿah law, and the punishments and things like that. Muslim governors, there's no reason for us to imagine that, at least right now, right? Maybe in the future that they become a fear, or maybe the population will embrace it. We don't know, right? But right now, there's no reason for us to fear that Muslims actually going to change the constitution, change the laws of the land. Even though the laws of the land, to be totally honest, are not even uniform if you think about things from state to state. And that includes things regarding issues of, because someone brought up the issue of age of marriage, the issue of child marriage, among other things, and the place that the common law plays in that. This is something that people need to look up. But I wanted to just conclude with this a part of the initial speech I didn't state. And I said it doesn't help, of course, that so many Muslim politicians and pundits happen to be committed socialists with nothing positive to say about the merits of America. This is just as concerning for us as it is for others, especially considering how they often act as proxies for moral progressives attacking Christians, Christianity, and the American system and the white population. That notwithstanding, Americans should come to terms with the fact that is moral decay, has been self-engineered. Because, you know, when we think about like how we understand the Constitution today is not the way that the founders understood the Constitution. A lot of what we talk about as being part of aspect of American values are actually matters that actually originate from moral progressivism, right? So things have changed in America, right? There have been different amendments. Is that it was not the work of Muslims, right? Since it is self-engineered, it was not the work of Muslims. And to quote my 2020 article entitled "A New Political Vision for Muslim America," written during the riots following the death of George Floyd, quote, there is no causal link between Islam and the race of divorce, suicide, homicide, incarceration, poverty, vagrancy, child abuse, drug abuse, and other violent crimes in America. Islam bears no responsibility for the unequal enforcement and illicit application of the Constitution, its legislative cancellation of rights by laws like the Patriot Act, or the spread of hate among the sundry classes of intersectional and oppressed people, now setting America ablaze. The same so-called Judeo-Christian civilization so many conservatives boast of is a real target of this newly embraced anti-capitalist, atheistic, hedonistic, nihilistic movement. Instead, all the discontent among feminists, gays, transgenders, racial minorities, and the poor is primarily directed against the world's economic elite and the Judeo-Christian civilizational supremacists. They respond to the historical violations committed against them by elite white Christians and others, not by Muslims. Islam is compatible with the U.S. Constitution because we are permitted to live under non-Muslim rule as religious minorities and obligated to honor the security guarantees we receive from our governments. And those governments promise to protect our persons, property, and dignity. We must honor the person, property, and dignity of our fellow citizens. And while there is anxiety about attempts to alter the penal code for specific crimes prescribed by Sharia law, such as neither the concern nor the courtesy of the common Muslim. These are concerns of those who hold political office. In Sharīʿah, they are called the Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, or laws applicable to statesmen, not to the common person. The sin of their non-implementation falls upon the governors, not citizens. They furthermore applied in Islamic polities, not those governed and dominated by non-Muslims. Much more could be said, but contrary to claims, there is and has never been a fear of loss of causality, epistemology, objective morality, justice, or free will due to the Ash'ari Ghazali embrace and promotion of theological voluntarism, Judaism, and educationalism. At any rate, there's much more to say. Really enjoyed the exchange. We definitely need more time to go into this and deal with the other issue, but thank you, all of you, for attending, and of course our interlocutors for being here with us.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to be here discussing various really the
Take James, take off.
We have to understand that Sharia guides all Muslims. As I mentioned in my talk, that Sharia doesn't allow Muslims to invoke Sharia law in a Muslim country. That must be appreciated as a fact and not be overlooked by the other very emotional allegations about Islam, Muslims, etc. But the other thing is my first point. We must respect the right for a sovereign nation for self-determination. So if Pakistan wants to legislate apostasy law according to how Pakistan wants it, we have to respect that sovereignty. We don't have the right. I hope you're not suggesting that the U.S. Constitution must become an imperial constitution, that everybody on the planet must abide by the rules of the U.S. Constitution. That is ridiculous. So I would say that the self-determination rule gives every country, every nation the right to determine their legal philosophy and their laws, and we must respect that as people who understand what God's intent is in diversity. That's where I think the buck starts. Again, thank you very much for being here. I'm very happy, very proud that we have this panel, and hopefully there'll be more occasions where we can discuss this openly. Thank you.
It's all we have 3 minutes.
Okay, well, alrighty, I'll try this. So, the United States is the civilizational inheritor of the civilization that grew out of the Mediterranean. Thus, that combination of Semitic revelation and Greek heritage. And Islamic civilization, Islam, first of all, Islamic civilization participated in that, was part of that. The original understanding of Islam from Christians was that this was a Christian heresy, and that somehow the Muslims had really just, it had a kind of somewhat derivative, sectarian kind of belief that was derived from Christianity. And we know as well that Islam, with the Islamic scholars and Islamic civilization, drew enormously from the Greek heritage. And so the United States inherited that civilizational flame as having been really an extension of England. And as France overthrew that order, overthrew that original order, and as England has drifted away from it, the United States and their founders rounded itself in a compact, the Declaration of Independence, which preserves that. And so, as Muslims, we actually can and should understand ourselves living in America to be participating in the only existing order, political order, that is a remnant of that original order. Because you can't look at Egypt and all these other places. These are really just kind of fragmented or relics. They're similar to similar to France and so on, which overthrew that original order. And so from that, we believe that the United States holds God to be the sovereign. God is the sovereign for the United States. The Constitution mentions God. People think that the Constitution does. The Declaration mentions God as the source of our rights, not human beings. Human beings are not the source of rights. That's where Corey's mistake had. God is the source of our rights, and human beings merely acknowledge it, as Blackstone said. And so when we as Muslims, we see that for example, laws reflect, or society reflects that inherent human dignity that all human beings were created with, that laws reflect justice, that laws reflect preservation of aims such as life, of aims such as personal property, of aims such as the family, and then we can support that. And we should support that, and we should encourage laws and support individuals who will implement laws that preserve those rights and that are grounded in those premises. And so that is Islam. Just because it is true that how you achieve those means may differ according to the context. How you preserve the safety of your fellow citizens may at one time seem the thing to do, to draw and quarter them, but then when you realize that, well, wait a minute, that actually offends human dignity, let's get closer to something that respects that while also achieving those goals. So I end by saying that I actually, as a Muslim, have zero conflict in my mind and my heart and as to being American and being Muslim, a faithful Muslim. And I want to love us, encourage other Muslims to understand how that is the case.
Thank you to all of our panelists for their thoughtful reflection, the presentations, and thank you to our audience for being very patient across 2 hours, including a somewhat rocky start there at the beginning as we got organized. So applause for all of them.